So, for this lecture, we're going to look at the centralization of government under the Grand Dukes and some of the changes, especially as they were Grand Dukes, in forming Florence into both a new Rome and into a real court city, as it had never been before. And I thought it would be useful to start by looking at what the transfer of power is in this period up until the end of the century. And as we've seen, Alessandro was the first duke, and his rulership ended in 1537 when he was assassinated. Then we have Cosimo, who we've been looking at, who is duke until 1569 and then becomes Grand Duke and remains Grand Duke until 1574. His son Francesco takes over at that point and rules until 1587 when he's assassinated by his brother. And his brother then takes over and he rules until beyond the end of the century into 1609. The Medici line continues on until 1737 when the last Medici male rules. And it's after that point, there's some discussion about who should take over the rulership of Florence. And ultimately, you have the Habsburg Lorraine Grand Dukes of Tuscany from that point forward. The last Medici was a woman, Maria Luisa, and it's thanks to her that Florence retained its ownership over the art that was produced, especially under the Grand Dukes, the Medici Grand Dukes. And she, in this negotiation over who should then take over the rulership of Florence, she negotiates that no works of art should be taken out of Florence, and that the buildings and such that the Medici had commissioned should be turned over to the Florentine people, which is why these palaces that were owned by the Medici are now museums and open to the public. So we've seen the work that was done in Palazzo Vecchio as Cosimo and his wife settled in there. And this building that's attached to Palazzo Vecchio is the Uffizi, which is the offices building, and today one of the most important museums in the world, especially for Renaissance painting. But it was intended to be where the various offices of the government would be put all together. They'd be centralized, and from there the Medici Grand Dukes could more easily watch over the goings-on of the government. In thinking about how this building should look, it was Giorgio Vasari who was given the task of designing the architecture. And he took his inspiration from Greek and Roman government buildings that have the same structure of these long wings that are connected on one end. These are called stoa, S-T-O-A, and they start in Athens and then are adopted by the Romans and are associated with the ideas of the golden ages of both Greece and Rome, and that important rulership in Rome in particular of the emperor. So it was well suited to the needs of the Medici rule and the messages that they wanted to convey about their own government. So you can see that what Vasari has done here is use classicizing vocabulary columns, these colonnades on the ground floor, and then pediments and such over the windows, things that are not surprising to see, especially in the context of Florence, because as you can tell, Vasari was very much influenced by what Michelangelo had done in the Medici Chapel at San Lorenzo, and no doubt there was an intended association between the decoration of that space and of the Laurentian Library, and this same decoration in the government building of the Medici. That gray and white patterning is there, and even some of the forms, like these rectangular forms, and this alternating pediment style, is something that you see in San Lorenzo. Here, not with the parts overlapping and being so constrained in space. In a way, Vasari has made this much more classicizing than what Michelangelo had done in San Lorenzo. Another fascinating aspect of this building is that Vasari constructs not only these office spaces, but he also constructs a corridor. And it's a corridor that attaches Palazzo Vecchio to the Uffizi and then continues from the Uffizi all the way across the Arno River over to the other side where the new Medici Palace was situated. And that palace of the Medici was Palazzo Pitti. Palazzo Pitti, which I'll jump ahead to so you can see it, there it is, was purchased by Eleonora and was meant to be the space where the Medici could spread out a bit more. As you can see, it's a very large palace, and larger than Palazzo Vecchio, and the living spaces available here especially. And it had ample gardens behind it. Today those gardens are known as the Boboli Gardens, and they are a wonderful place to visit in Florence. Palazzo Pitti was deemed important for the Medici court because it provided these spaces where important foreign dignitaries could be entertained, and the gardens, having these gardens behind the palace, made it comparable to princely palaces throughout Europe that also had gardens with fountains and other kinds of sculptures in them. And this is a really important part of court culture throughout Europe in this last half of the century. But Vasari made it so that the Medici would never have to walk down on the pavement of the Florentine streets in order to get between their palaces. This corridor connects it so that they don't have to do that. So the Medici would go from Palazzo Vecchio through the Uffizi, and then from here it opens up into a kind of secretive corridor that then goes across the upper part of this loggia that runs alongside the Arno, crosses over Ponte Vecchio, the oldest bridge in Florence. It's this mezzanine level is the corridor that keeps running across. As you can see, it cuts through residences. It actually went through people's houses so that it could continue around. Here, just another view so you can see how it goes from the Uffizi and the buildings near the Uffizi, and then across, and it continues across the Arno. This is a view of what it looks like in the interior. It's just a very simple vaulted space. It's now decorated with perhaps the largest collection of self-portraits in the world. These are all self-portraits that artists had done of themselves and the Medici collected, especially in the 17th century. The corridor continues and goes in front of churches. This is the Church of Santa Felicita, the one with Pontormo's altarpiece inside. They created this loggia in front of the church, and as you can see, the corridor continues here. Just to remind you of which church we're looking at. Oops. Hang on just a sec. Vasari made it so that as the Medici were passing through the corridor, if they wanted to stop and see the Mass taking place in the Church of Santa Felicita, they could easily do so. And in fact, there's a little balcony level that they could access, And you can see there are little prayer benches there for the Medici or their guests to use as they're passing through the corridor. So this gives you the view into the church, and then there's a little doorway where they could go and access this balcony level. Beautifully decorated, by the way, with these Persian rugs that are another important part of material culture in Renaissance Italy as trade networks are expanding. So just so you can see where we've come so far with the corridor, there's Palazzo Vecchio. Here's where the connection to the Uffizi happens. Go through the Uffizi, you go through here, go across the Arno, it keeps going. This is the Church of Santa Felicita. It keeps going, cutting through people's houses, and then it opens up. You can either go near the grotto here, which we'll look at, or continue on until you get to the site of Palazzo Pitti. It's just an extraordinary thing that was created here. So once you got to Palazzo Pitti, what you would see here are these extraordinarily beautifully decorated apartments of the Medici. Much of this has been redone in subsequent centuries, however. This is a view into the courtyard of Palazzo Pitti, and this is where much of the spectacle would take place. They would put on these huge productions for the entertainment of their guests. I should mention that this courtyard was redone. The outside of Palazzo Pitti, for the most part, was done by Brunelleschi for the Pitti family, which is why it's called Palazzo Pitti. But Ammanati, that same sculptor who had worked on the Neptune fountain, designed this courtyard space. And you can see that there's some real connections with Sansovino's architecture in Venice that we looked at, like the treatment of these banded columns, which is very much like what we saw at the Mint in Venice. And of course, Sansovino was originally a Florentine sculptor, so these connections could easily have been made between the two. This is image, a print showing you one of the spectacles that took place here. They would even stage naval battles inside of the courtyard and fill it up with water and have these naval battles take place. They would do all kinds of amazing spectacles in the palaces, and this was true across Europe in this period. And again, it's just a way that Florence is trying to be, on par with all of the other courts and what they're able to do for their guests. Another interesting part of what happens at Palazzo Pitti is the decoration of the gardens. And in the Boboli Gardens, you have a grotta, a sort of cave, where Buontalenti, who was an architect and a sculptor, created this rather magical space. It's really meant to look like it is just natural, that it just emerged from nature. And in it were placed some sculptures, some of which were pre-made, like Michelangelo's slaves were originally incorporated into this space. And then all of this wall decoration is done in stucco and meant to look like those sort of stalactite formations. There are also shells and all sorts of natural materials that are used for the decoration of this space. Oops. There were also funny fountains that were made. This is a fountain that was made by the sculptor Valerio Cioli, Cioli, and he made it for Cosimo. This is Cosimo's favorite dwarf, Morgante. Another part of court culture in the late part of the 16th century and throughout the 17th century was having dwarfs at your court that would be there for entertainment or provide companionship for the ruler or his family members or guests. And Morgante, the dwarf of Cosimo I, was truly beloved by Cosimo, and we see him represented in a lot of the art that was made for Cosimo. Morgante looked like Cosimo. He was sort of the mini-me of Cosimo, and that certainly appealed to Cosimo. But these dwarves would perform. They would be sort of court jester types, or some were really musically talented and would perform their music. But it is a kind of staple figure that you find in the late Renaissance and Baroque courts of Europe. Here in this sculpture group, clearly Cioli is playing on the idea of the equestrian monument, and so we see Morgante nude, and instead of being on a horseback, he's on turtleback, and obviously it's meant to really play up Morgante's proportions in relation to the turtle. He's in the same position as equestrian monument, and in fact, if you compare it to the one done of Cosimo later on, you can see that the connection, the play that's being made so obviously here. In religious works produced for public spaces in this period, there are major redecorations happening in the church, in all of the churches in Florence and throughout the Catholic churches' strongholds, in part in response to the Protestant Reformation, which we'll be talking about in the next video series. So what we see here is a fresco that was done in San Lorenzo. It's on the left-hand side of the nave in the Church of San Lorenzo. Vasari was given the task of redecorating many of the churches of Florence, and that usually involved whitewashing the wall, so painting over previous decorative programs and then placing new programs of altarpieces on the altars on the side chapels of the church, altarpieces that conformed more closely with these new ideals for religious art of the Counter-Reformatory period. What Bronzino does in San Lorenzo is create this very large fresco of the martyrdom of St. Lawrence. It makes sense that the subject matter would be chosen, of course, because St. Lawrence is who the Church of San Lorenzo is dedicated to. The Medici continued patronage of San Lorenzo also makes sense, as it makes those ties between the new Medici regime and the old good Medicis as they were seen, as I talked about in the last video. What we see here, though, this particular choice of showing a martyrdom scene really connects to the ideas of the Counter-Reformation, where these scenes of the suffering, the sacrifices made by the early Christian saints in particular, are emphasized, and martyrdom scenes become one of the most common religious scenes that we find in churches post-Reformation. What we have here, though, is not yet the style that will emerge in a response to the Counter-Reformation, the Baroque style, This is still what we would call late Renaissance, and particularly in the Maniera style, which of course is what Bronzino was known to work in. And what we have here is just an array of nude bodies in all sorts of different contorted positions, very much like what Michelangelo does in the Last Judgment that we saw in the Sistine Chapel. But here, you have this mass of nude, twisted bodies, some of which are absolutely coming directly from looking at Michelangelo. Like this figure corresponds with the figure of Day in the Medici chapels, which are, of course, in the same building. But overemphasized musculature. He's going, Michelangelo is the source, and then he pushes it to the next level, overdoing even more, making it as artificial as possible, which is what the Maniera was all about. In the middle, we have St. Lawrence, who is being grilled. That is how he was martyred. And he has raised up partially and famously is asking to be flipped over on the other side because he was already done on that side. And it shows that, he's willing to suffer, the acceptance that this is part of his path to martyrdom. And you can see that the angels have already started coming down from heaven to give him the crown of martyrdom and the palm. And one is holding the chalice, which is, of course, connected to the Eucharist. But it's a confusing scene, and in fact, it takes a little bit even to find St. Lawrence in the middle of this mass of twisting figures. And those are aspects that will be rejected by the Baroque period. And as art is meant to be clearer and more instructive, more easily understood by the viewer. This is the Church of San Lorenzo where Bronzino's fresco is found, and I show it to you from this aerial view because the Medici continue to build onto San Lorenzo, and in fact, in this period of the last decades of the 16th century, they build on this large structure onto the back of the church, and this large structure was meant to be the new burial site for the Grand Dukes. So you have the old sacristy, which was for that first important generation of Medici. You have the new sacristy over here, which had that generation of you had the golden age Medici of Lorenzo and Giuliano, and then the Medici of the beginnings of the de facto rulership of Florence with the other Lorenzo and Giuliano, and then you need now a more appropriate burial space for the Grand Dukes, and so that is the space that is created. It's Buontalenti that is given the project of adding on this large chapel, which was meant to be seen from the nave of the church. What this space looks like as it's eventually completed is this, and it's now known as the Cappella dei Principi, the Prince's Chapel. And you can see that incredibly rich materials are used for the decoration. You have these pietre dure panels that make up the floor tiles, multicolored marbles around the walls, large gilded bronze figures that represent the different Medici that are buried here are placed in these niches. It is just over the top in the lavishness of the space. Here's some other views of the same space. The colors are so different in each of these images that this is the best image to show you exactly what the color is like. But you can see every panel shows a different colored marble, and these marbles were acquired from all over the world and brought here to be used in the decoration of this space. It's extraordinary, to say the least. This is a later Cosimo. This is Cosimo II. But just to show you one of the completed burial spaces. This is the area of the altar. The altar space was, and these later, the completion of the chapel space and the later decoration was done by Matteo Nigetti and Don Giovanni de' Medici, who was, of course, a member of the Medici family, but also an architect. They closed off this space here. This originally was planned to be open, and this opens directly into the space of the nave of the church, but it was later decided to close that off. And that brings us to the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, which I'll start dealing with in the next lecture.